On August 1st, 2023, the United States Treasury had approximately 30 hours of cash left, not 30 days, 30 hours. After that, for the first time in 248 years of American history, the US government would have been unable to meet its obligations, unable to pay its soldiers, its creditors, its Social Security recipients. Congress extended the debt ceiling. The crisis passed. Most people forgot about it within a week. But here's the thing nobody said out loud after that near miss. The debt that caused it is now $6 trillion larger. The interest bill on that debt now exceeds what the US spends on its military, and the ceiling will come up again. So today I want to do something almost no coverage of this topic actually does. Walk you through what happens, mechanically, specifically, in sequence. If the next time that ceiling hits, Congress doesn't extend it in time, not as a political statement, not as a prediction, as an honest look at what the cascade actually looks like, who it hits first, and why the consequences aren't what most people imagine. Because here's what surprises people when they actually trace it through. The countries that get hurt first aren't America's enemies. And the outcome doesn't look like collapse. It looks like something more complicated and more permanent than that. I'm James Whitmore. Let's go. The first thing to understand is that a US default doesn't work the way the word sounds. When most people hear default, they picture a single dramatic moment. America announces it can't pay. The world panics. The dollar collapses. Chaos. That's not how it happens. What actually happens is a cascade, and the cascade starts not with an announcement, but with a missed payment, something much more mundane and much more consequential. On day one, the Treasury misses a scheduled interest payment to bondholders. The amount might be relatively small in the context of the overall debt, a few $billion. But the point isn't the amount, the point is the signal. US Treasury bonds have been treated as the world's risk-free asset since the end of World War II. The moment that changes, even for 24 hours, it doesn't just change in America, it changes everywhere simultaneously. Within hours, the major credit rating agencies are reviewing their US sovereign debt ratings. One already downgraded America in 2023, another did it in 2025. A third cut follows a missed payment almost immediately, and each downgrade triggers automatic responses across the global financial system. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and money market funds around the world are legally required to hold only investment-grade assets. They're forced to sell US Treasuries, not because they want to, because their mandates require it. That selling pressure drives Treasury prices down and yields up. When yields go up, everything priced against them goes up too. Mortgage rates, corporate borrowing costs, auto loans, credit card rates. In the United States, roughly 70% of adjustable rate mortgages are indexed to Treasury yields. Within days of a default, millions of American homeowners are looking at higher mortgage bills they didn't see coming. That's the first place it lands, not in headlines, in monthly payments. Now here's the international dimension, and this is the part that's almost never clearly explained. The countries that take the biggest immediate hit from a US default aren't China or Russia. They're Japan, the United Kingdom, South Korea, and much of the European Union. America's closest democratic allies are the largest foreign holders of US Treasury securities. Japan alone holds approximately $1.1 trillion. The UK around $700 billion. Together, America's allies have more than $5 trillion in US government debt sitting on their balance sheets, in their pension funds, their sovereign wealth funds, their central bank reserves. When those bonds lose value, and they do, fast, it doesn't just hit abstract government accounts, it hits the pension funds of British teachers, Japanese retirees, Korean civil servants. The assumptions their entire retirement systems are built on get repriced in real time. And because financial systems are interconnected in ways that 2008 made viscerally clear, the shock doesn't stay in the bond market. It spreads to equities, to credit, to currencies. all within roughly the same 72-hour window. If you want this kind of analysis every week, the mechanics underneath the headlines, subscribing to the channel takes 2 seconds. And if this is landing, a like genuinely helps more people find it. Now, China's position, because this is the paradox at the center of the whole story. China currently holds approximately $750 billion in US Treasury securities. That number has been declining. China has been quietly diversifying away from treasuries for years, which we covered in our Fed chair video. But $750 billion means a US default materially damages China's foreign exchange reserves. That's a real loss. Here's where it gets complicated. A US default that seriously undermines the dollar's reserve currency status, which the more severe scenarios involve, is something China has been actively working toward for a decade. The Belt and Road Initiative, yuan internationalization, the BRICS currency discussions, bilateral trade agreements that settle in local currencies rather than dollars, all of it is infrastructure for a world where the dollar is less central. So China faces a scenario where it loses on its treasury holdings and potentially advances its long-term strategic objectives simultaneously. That's not a comfortable position. It's not a clean win, but it's also not purely a loss. And that ambiguity is why China's response to a US default would be the most consequential and least predictable variable in the entire cascade. The third thing, and this is where most coverage gets it most wrong, is what the aftermath actually looks like. A US default doesn't end American power. It restructures it. The dollar has been the world's reserve currency since the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. That status gives America something economists call exorbitant privilege, the ability to borrow cheaply in its own currency, to run persistent deficits without immediate consequence, to sanction adversaries by cutting them off from dollar-denominated systems. The Iran sanctions work because oil is priced in dollars. The Russia sanctions work because international financial transfers route through dollar systems. A default doesn't make that privilege disappear overnight. The dollar has survived every previous stress test because there's no obvious replacement. The euro lacks the depth of US financial markets. The yuan isn't fully convertible. Gold doesn't scale. This is the dismisser's strongest argument, and it's genuinely not wrong. But a default changes the terms. It makes the privilege negotiable in a way it has never been before. Countries that were previously willing to hold dollars because it was the unambiguous safe haven now do a calculation they didn't have to do before. They diversify. Not away from dollars entirely, but away from the assumption that dollars are permanently risk-free. And as more of them make that calculation, the cost of the privilege rises. America can still borrow, but at higher rates, with less ability to use the dollar as a geopolitical weapon because the countries on the receiving end of those weapons now have more alternatives than they did. That's what the morning after a US default actually looks like. Not collapse. Restructuring. A world where American financial power still exists but is no longer taken for granted, where the specific tools that have made US foreign policy uniquely effective since 1944 become more expensive to deploy and less reliable in their effects. Congress has extended the debt ceiling 78 times since it was created. It will almost certainly extend it again. The near miss of 2023 resolved. Every crisis everyone assumed was coming has so far not materialized. The most likely outcome is the same pattern: last-minute resolution, political theatre, another extension. But the debt keeps growing. The interest bill keeps climbing. The structural dynamics that produce these near misses don't improve with each extension. They worsen, and at some point, not necessarily soon, not necessarily in a dramatic way, the question of what happens if Congress doesn't extend, it stops being theoretical. When that moment comes, it won't announce itself. It'll start with a Treasury payment nobody's heard of, followed by a credit rating action, followed by a yield move that shows up in your mortgage rate before the news cycle catches up. Understanding the cascade before it starts is the only advantage anyone gets. This is James Whitmore. The debt story is ongoing. Subscribe so you're there when it moves.